Hello and welcome to this episode of The Museum. Today we explore the unsolved murder of San Diego Police Detective Charles Harris, which occurred in 1927.
San Diego of the 1920s was a city on the move. Less than a decade after the wildly successful exposition thrust Balboa Park onto the map, the United States Navy opened a 541-acre training center in 1923. 1 year later, Claude Ryan began the first year-round scheduled airline service in the United States. In 1927, the El Cortez was christened as the tallest building in the city, and the Star of India was towed from the Isle of Man to San Diego Harbor, where it resides today. The biggest civic event of the year should have been the May 9th departure of Charles Lindbergh, as he flew the Spirit of St. Louis from San Diego to New York, then on to Paris, France, in the world's first transatlantic flight. Unfortunately, there was a dark side to what should have been San Diego's best year. An armed robber prowled the underbelly of Lovers Lanes and Balboa Park, sneaking up on parked cars and then using a flashlight to blind the occupants inside the vehicle. The gunman was long gone by the time the victims could find a phone to call the police. For a police department that enjoyed a reputation of always getting their man, including a record of no unsolved bank robberies, officers were eager to bring the gunman to justice. Charles Rice Harris was born on March 27, 1876, in the tiny community of Witter, Arkansas, an unincorporated area of Madison County. He was appointed to the San Diego Police Department on January 21, 1911. Prior to joining the police department, he had worked as a motorman for the railroad. After his appointment, Harris worked a variety of assignments, including the bicycle squad, horse-mounted patrol, street patrolman, and ultimately detective. Harris lived at 2060 Defoe Street in the Ocean Beach district of San Diego with his wife Leona and their 10-year-old niece Gwendolyn. Defoe Street was later renamed Sunset Cliffs Boulevard. Sunday, April 3rd, 1927 was typical for San Diego weather, dry and cool. With a maximum high of just 66 degrees, the weather was conducive to what could be a long stakeout in an idle car in Balboa Park. With the sunset predicted just after 6 p.m. and a waxing crescent moon as cover, Detective Charles Harris could not have picked a better day to offer himself up as bait to a stick-up artist who relied on the shadows for cover.
We are standing at the entrance to San Diego's historic Balboa Park. It was within this park on April 3, 1927, when San Diego Police Detective Charles Harris met with Officer Bert Lusk and two policewomen, Rena Wright and Olga Nelson. They met here to formulate a plan wherein they would separate into two separate cars and then park in a remote area of Balboa Park and pose as boyfriend, girlfriend, lovers, in a common practice which was called petting at the time. They would park there in the hopes that a very prolific robber who had been active within the park for a while would approach them, attempt to rob them, and at that time they would attempt to apprehend him. Cut.
The group separated. Olga Nelson and Louis Lusk went south. Rena Wright and Charles Harris went north. According to Rena, she said they drove past the Indian village, then behind the Roosevelt School, where they settled into the dark to wait for the robber to strike.
We are now at the northern end of Balboa Park. We're at the area that we understand that Detective Harris and his partner parked on that evening. It was about 8 o'clock in the evening on April 3rd when they parked here and were going to pose as boyfriend-girlfriend in the hopes that the robber would come up to that location. After several moments of being parked there, Rena Wright said to Harris, "Charlie, do you think we should find out what's going on or report into headquarters?" So he looked at his watch and apparently agreed and started to go for the ignition key when on the driver's side of the vehicle, a robber approached. The robber had what was ultimately described as a bright torch or a flashlight, bright torch being the vernacular for a flashlight at the time. The robber has a gun and this flashlight. He points the gun at them and says, "This is a stick-up." But in a deviation from his normal way of operating, he immediately begins shooting, striking Harris at least 2 times, maybe 3 times. Harris is fatally wounded. He falls across the seat of the vehicle, and it was at that time that the robber flees. Now, Rena Wright then tries to move Harris, and she's able to move him a little bit in the car. She starts up the car, and then she leaves that location and drives down to the San Diego Police Department headquarters, which at the time also had what we today call an urgent care. There was a police surgeon located there, and it was determined at that time that Harris had succumbed to his injuries. What we're looking at here is what we believe may have been the probable escape route of the robber. This area is the rear portion of Balboa Park, and in this particular area there's heavy vegetation. There's a downhill slope that goes into the back of Balboa Park, and of course, as you can see, once in there you're basically lost. The home across the street was built in 1924 and was there at the time. In fact, police officers went to that residence that night to see if there were any witnesses to the crime.
Charles Harris was most likely dead at the scene. However, Rena needed to get help. According to the police report, she was unable to move her partner from the driver's side of the car, so she wound up driving from the passenger side back to the emergency hospital within police headquarters at 700 2nd Avenue. We don't know for sure how she got there. However, the most expeditious route would have been down Richmond Street south onto the 11th Avenue extension, then into downtown. The red arrow on the 1927 map depicts where the shooting occurred. The dotted line follows the path of the 11th Avenue extension. At San Diego Police Department headquarters, Dr. Paul Brust, the police surgeon, confirmed everyone's worst fear. Detective Harris was dead on arrival. Meanwhile, Rena Wright gathered up several officers and returned to the scene for a search. Due to a lack of police radios, Officers Lusk and Nelson were completely unaware anything had gone wrong. All officers were called back to duty, and a massive search was conducted in the area. It was to no avail. The killer was long gone. When Chief of Police James Patrick was notified of the murder of Charles Harris, officers across the city were mobilized. Typically, that would have meant roadblocks would have been put up along each major thoroughfare in and out of the city. Unfortunately, the efforts were to no avail. The killer had simply vanished.
On the day after the murder, Rena Wright wrote a report for the department describing what the events were of the evening during the robbery murder. On April 7th, 1927, a coroner's inquest was convened. A coroner's inquest was the jurors were selected for the coroner's inquest. The coroner would impanel a jury and bring in witnesses to whatever the event was, and then they could later determine if it was a homicide, if it was a suicide, if it was a justifiable homicide, an accidental death, whatever the circumstances were. So on April 7th, 1927, Rena Wright appeared before the jury, the coroner's jury. And during that time, she testified, and her testimony was somewhat puzzling, because during her statements, she had first said that Charles Harris never fired his weapon during the robbery, when in fact, when detectives arrived at the scene, they found Harris's gun on the floor of his vehicle with 5 expended rounds. 2 of the rounds were in the door of the vehicle. Rena Wright, however, testified that he had never shot his weapon. During the coroner's inquest, she again testified that Charles Harris had not fired his weapon. She was then asked what caliber weapon she possessed on the day of the murder, and she said she didn't recall. She was asked what the caliber of her weapon was, and she didn't recall. We don't know why, but it appears that that's where the testimony ended, without further questioning of, gee whiz, why don't you remember? We don't know. In the aftermath of the murder of Detective Harris, of course, the police were looking for many suspects. They actually interviewed some suspects up in the Los Angeles area and picked up a couple suspects in the San Diego area. And then in May of 1927, an individual walked into the sheriff's office and said he knew he was wanted in San Diego. His name was Delbo, his last name. He had a couple AKAs, one of them being Cree, the other one being King. He said that he did not kill Detective Harris. However, he said he had been doing similar robberies in the park, and he was present that evening, he said, hiding in the area and wanting to rob people in another car when a suspect went up to the Harris vehicle and shot and killed Harris. But he said he didn't do it. He did confess to several other robberies around the city. So far, history doesn't tell us why he was released and never prosecuted. We did find one small article that said that the police discounted his statement or his confession because it looked like because he was from the San Diego area and wanted by the Army for desertion, he just wanted to get out of any charges in Colorado and get a free ride back to San Diego. Other individuals that were picked up for the as suspects in the robbery were compared to one of them had a gun, and the projectile was compared to the Harris projectile, and it did not match. It was the same caliber weapon. So there were a lot of suspects that were looked at during that period of time, and but we don't know why they didn't pursue some of them. We assume that they just did some good police work and said, no, this is not the person. But that being what it is, that's where we're at today. We don't know who killed Detective Charles Harris.
Could badge number 22 be cursed? On May 10th, 1924, Officer Herbert Webster is wearing badge 22 when he was shot in the head while investigating a suspicious vehicle. He never fully recovered from his injuries, and when he died on January 24th, 1951, the San Diego Union declared, quote, "Bullet wound through the brain proves fatal to former policeman." 3 years later, Detective Harris was shot and killed while wearing badge number 22. Despite exhaustive efforts of teams of investigators poring over every tiny clue, Both cases remain unsolved. Several other officers also wore Badge 22. Gene Muehlheisen was a World War II veteran and served a distinguished 20-year career when he retired as a captain in 1960, but not before playing a large part in creating a modern code of ethics for police. Captain Muehlheisen later became the executive director of the California Peace Officer Standards and Training. Lieutenant Richard Boas also wore Badge 22 during his 32-year SDPD career. Like Captain Muehlheisen, Lieutenant Boas was not seriously injured during his career. When the San Diego Police Department became aware of the tragic coincidence of badge number 22, it was permanently removed from service. Charles Harris wasn't the only San Diego police officer whose career ended in Balboa Park. On September 30th, 1928, Officer Lewis Lusk, the other half of the plan to capture the Lover's Lane bandit, was found slumped across the wheel of his police car while patrolling his beat in Balboa Park. A passerby summoned help. However, Lusk was dead on arrival at Mercy Hospital. The April 3rd incident was also the beginning of the end for the careers of the policewomen. Less than a year after the Harris murder, Chief of Police Joe Duran demanded the resignation of both women when they were involved in a shooting in Balboa Park. Balboa Park is often called the crown jewel of the city of San Diego. However, there's a dark side to it as well. More San Diego police officers have died in the line of duty in Balboa Park than in any other location in the city. Most recent was the September 1984 slaying of 2 officers while on a routine citation for underage drinking. It's been more than 90 years since the murder of Charles Harris, so the likelihood of the case being solved is extremely slim. However, that doesn't mean this mystery needs to be forgotten. The name of Charles Harris is forever immortalized at police headquarters in San Diego, on the California Peace Officers Memorial, and also in Washington, D.C. So please, take a moment and remember not only Charles Harris, but all the valiant officers who have paid the ultimate sacrifice in keeping America safe. Thank you for watching this episode of the museum. We really hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up down below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We post new videos as they become available. For more information on the San Diego Police Museum, visit our website, and of course, we are open to the public as well. And as always, thank you for watching.